Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Cabinet of Curiosities on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier and I'm here at 17 Wing in Winnipeg having a look at an AN-N6 camera, also known as a gun sight aim point or G.S.A.P camera. Now if you're like me and you watch an inordinate number of World War II documentaries, you've probably noticed a certain type of stock footage appearing again and again. This is typically very grainy, black and white footage shot from the perspective of a fighter or ground attack aircraft and shows an enemy bomber or train or something like that being shot to pieces. And you've probably wondered, well, who was actually shooting that footage and why? Well, wonder no more, because that footage was actually taken by cameras like this, which were generically known as gun cameras. Now, these would be mounted on the aircraft, typically in the wing next to the guns themselves, or sometimes in a special periscopic mounting that allowed the camera to look directly through the pilot's reflector gun sight. And for more on those, I do have a previous video on how reflector gun sights work, so please check that out. Now, the camera would be activated when the pilot pressed the trigger button on the control column and would take a certain amount of footage as long as the guns were firing, and sometimes for a couple of seconds afterward. Now, this is done for a variety of reasons. For example, training. So pilot trainees could be shown footage from actual combat to show, different tactics for engaging the enemy, or they could be engaging in mock combat during their training course with guns not fitted and with only the camera fitted to the aircraft, and then the instructor could develop the film and project it and critique the students' tactics. This is also done for evaluating combat effectiveness. So for example, you could review footage from actual combat and see why your pilots were not shooting down as many enemy aircraft as you expected and issue corrections and different orders to that effect. You could also evaluate enemy tactics and say the technical details and the performance of any new enemy aircraft that entered the field of combat. And finally, these cameras were used to confirm aerial victories. So pilots are a bit of a boastful sort. They tend to exaggerate a lot of their exploits in the air, and sometimes in the heat of battle, you tend to forget details and you end up claiming victories that, were never really yours. And since aerial victories required at least one other witness in order to confirm, gun cameras like this were a great way of having an impartial witness to whatever victory a pilot claimed. So there were a lot of different uses for this type of camera. So the various belligerent nations of World War II used many different types of gun cameras. For example, the Germans mainly used the Robot 2, which was a commercial 35mm still camera that they heavily modified into a film camera for use aboard Luftwaffe aircraft, whereas the Allies mainly used the G.S.A.P. So the G.S.A.P was developed by Bell & Howell, which was a major manufacturer of film cameras and projectors based out of Chicago, and thousands of these were produced both by Bell & Howell and also the camera division of Fairchild Aircraft, which made this particular example. This is a 16mm film camera that loads from standard commercial Kodak cartridges, which contain 50 feet of film. It's electrically powered, which means that it would have to be plugged into the electrical system of whatever aircraft it was mounted on. Now, there were four main versions of the G.S.A.P, designated M1, M2, N1, and N2. And the M series were meant to run off of 12 volts DC, whereas the N series ran off of 24 volts DC, depending on what aircraft they were going to be mounted on. The 1 designation meant a standard lens like this one, which would normally be mounted in the wing of the aircraft, whereas the 2 designation stood for a special mounting bracket with a periscopic prism that allowed the camera to look straight through the reflector gun sight and thus record the point of view of the pilot. Now, let's actually have a closer look at this camera and see how it actually works. Right, so starting on the back of the camera, we can see the 4 mounting studs for mounting the camera in the wing of an aircraft. You can also see the hatch for loading the film cartridge. Now, this could also be fitted with a special sighting device, which is essentially a dummy cartridge with an eyepiece attached to it, and this allowed ground crews to see through the camera lens and allowed them to adjust the alignment of the camera and align it with the guns. Now on the bottom, you'll see there that's the plug for the electrical supply, and that would be plugged into the aircraft's DC electrical system. Right, so moving on to the front of the camera, we can see a number of data plates. It shows that this particular model was built by Fairchild Aviation in New York, and is a 12-volt version. So since this has a regular forward-facing lens, this would be an M1 model. There's also a sticker showing that this was overhauled by the RCAF in the mid-1950s, and indeed G.S.A.P cameras continue to be used well into the jet age. At the bottom here, we have a little indicator window and a knob, and this is to indicate how much film is left to expose in the cartridge. And finally, up here, we have the knob for controlling the film speed. So the camera could be set to record at either 16, 32, or 64 frames per second, depending on how much detail was needed of a particular engagement. This is an electrically driven camera, and it actually operates off a constant speed electric motor. And so the switch from speed to speed is actually done mechanically. And I've pulled apart another example of the G.S.A.P that didn't have a lens, and you can see the very complicated gear train and how it switches from speed to speed when I turn the speed adjustment knob. You'll also see the motor there with its bevel gear drive, as well as the rotary shutter at the front, which is very similar to the shutter I showed you in the Hawkeye camera a few videos ago. And finally, we get to the lens. Now, the standard lens for the G.S.A.P was 35mm with an aperture of f3.5. And what's missing here is a yellow filter that was typically fitted over the lens to filter out blue light and increase the contrast of the black and white footage, since you were typically filming against a bright blue sky. You also have a number of aperture adjustment knobs on the side here, and these would be adjusted according to the exterior lighting conditions and what speed you were filming at. So for example, on the middle dial here, this is the adjustment for outside conditions, and we have 3 settings for bright, hazy, and dull. And then we have this outer knob here, which gives the 3 different speeds, 16, 32, or 64 frames per second. Now, one last technical detail, the G.S.A.P as originally configured would start filming as soon as the pilot pushed the trigger button and would stop filming as soon as the button was released. But it could also be fitted with a unit called an Overrun Control, which allowed it to continue filming for up to 3 seconds after the trigger button was released. And the amount of time that it continued filming after release could be adjusted by a knob on the unit. And the camera lens unit had a special little pointer inside that would protrude into the aperture and could be seen on film as soon as the gun button was released. You could actually see when the pilot stopped firing and when the overrun filming began. So in addition to fighter aircraft, G.S.A.Ps were also used on a variety of other aircraft, including bombers, for example, being mounted to the remote gun controls of the B-29 Superfortress. And although these were intended for rigid mounting, a lot of them saw use as regular handheld 16mm movie cameras, and pilots and ground crew would often improvise their own pistol grips or even mount battery packs to the cameras to allow them to be used independently of an aircraft's electrical system. And a lot of these improvised mountings are pretty cool because they're just the grip from the top of an aircraft control column that's been bolted to the camera. But hey, it works. Now, some of these handheld cameras were used in combat, but the vast majority saw use in training. And these are mainly used for filming and evaluating the performance of pilot trainees. And for this particular video, I have a very special treat for you. Now, my friend Matt Heinz, who is an avid RCAF collector and who has supplied a lot of the interesting items we've looked at previously on this channel, including reflector gun sights, bomb sights, bubble sextants, and the astrograph, came across a roll of 16mm film that was shot on a G.S.A.P during World War II. And he had this digitized, and I'm going to show it to you right now. And what's really neat about this is that so far as I can tell, this footage has never seen the light of day since it was shot during the Second World War. So this is an exclusive to our own devices. And you can see that this depicts a flight of Bristol Bolingbroke, which is the Canadian version of the Bristol Blenheim, somewhere over Canada on training exercises. And did a little bit of research and actually found out which aircraft these are and where they were stationed. Now, at first we were a little bit baffled because the numbers on the aircraft didn't seem to match the aircraft type. But then by looking at the asymmetric nose of the Bolingbroke, we realized that the footage was actually reversed. And so when you flip it over, you get the proper numbers. So as you can see, this footage depicts aircraft 10211 and 10218. And these are both Bolingbroke Mark IV Ts and are manufactured by Fairchild Canada in Longueuil, Quebec in May 1943 and delivered shortly thereafter to No. 1 Bombing and Gunnery School in Jarvis, Ontario. And both served for about a year and a half until they were damaged in accidents, 10211 on November 25, 1944, and 10218 on September 22, 1944, and then they were both scrapped. So I just think it's neat to be able to have a look at this footage that really hasn't seen the light of day for nearly 80 years. And so a huge shout out to Matt Heinz for allowing me to feature it in this video. Anyway, as I said before, thousands upon thousands of G.S.A.P cameras were manufactured during the war, and they were used until the very end of the conflict. However, at the end of the war, the massive demobilization meant that cameras like this became surplus to requirements, so a lot of them were sold off on the civilian market, often with special kits with a pistol grip and a battery pack to allow them to be used as regular 16mm movie cameras, and this is how a lot of them survive to this day in civilian hands. This didn't mean, however, that there was no longer a practical military use for cameras like this, far from it. These continued to be used by various air forces well into the jet age, particularly during the Korean War. But as aircraft started flying faster and higher and guided missiles were developed, a lot of engagement started taking place beyond visual range, and so cameras like this became less and less useful for gauging tactical effectiveness. So you'll still see gun cameras used once in a while. There's, of course, the famous ground attack footage from the Gulf War, but they're not used nearly as much as they were during the Second World War. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. A special shout out to Gord Crossley and the rest of the Heritage staff here at 17 Wing for allowing me to look through their collection and bring you interesting artifacts like this. I guarantee you that there's more where this came from and that will be featured in future videos. But until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.